Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Man Buns and Jesus. I didn't remember to check which episode we're on, but we're in season 5, the season of the Exodus. We're continuing through what God did for his people, what God expected from his people in that book. And today we're going to look at chapter 15, which, if you've been following along with this podcast, chapter 15 is immediately after what is one of the more iconic Bible events, and that is the parting of the Red Sea. And what we see in chapter 15 is we see Moses respond. And he responds with, let's call it 17 verses of song that to us really doesn't sound so much like song because it's now translated in English and loses a lot of its, rhythmic qualities. But for the sake of time, we're not going to read those 17 verses. If you want, you can pause this podcast or this video, whichever you're on, and read Exodus chapter 15. But we're going to just step into it. And your background is and the people of Israel are celebrating what God has done with music. And Ben, to introduce our guest and to tell us where we're going, I'm going to leave that to you.
Sure. Uh, I've found myself to be quite opinionated when it comes to worship practices. Um,
But that's the only place he's opinionated.
well, fair. I'm often quite opinionated, but this is especially one of those places where I find myself quite opinionated. And worship in our modern context, I think often looks very different than what we see in Moses' pretty spontaneous song here. And so to bring us a little more expertise in the worship world and somebody else who's probably just as strongly opinionated as I am. We brought on Dr. Jim Marriott, who's a return guest to the show, um, to help us just kind of break down like what is Moses doing and what does that tell us about maybe what we should be doing and how does that or does that not reflect what we see in our churches today? So, Jim, I'll throw it over to you. What strikes you from the songs of Moses and even the little one-liner that Miriam gives us too, um, about the way that they're worshiping and their emphases and what they're doing there?
That's great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me as always. And I need more lead time for these so that I can grow out my hair, so that I can actually be part of the man bun legacy.
We'll give you 8 months next time.
Yeah, yeah, I'll just start now, and maybe when I'm ready, we'll do this again. But luckily, this is all audio, so you can't see me one way or the other, and that's lovely. So that's good. Is it audio? Are you people actually watching this? I don't know. Who knows?
I think we have one person who watches through the whole YouTube video.
Wow. Okay. Well, good for that person. God bless. That's good. Well, yeah. And as far as worship opinions go, actually, I like to take pride that it's my job to not have opinions, but cultivate opinions. But I'm sure I have them too, and so I'll own my biases just like everybody else. And here we go. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity, guys. It's really great to be with you. So in terms of the Song of Moses. Yeah, I think you framed it really well, Ben. And Josh, you guys too, with your Exodus study and what has just happened here. And if you think about the whole scope of where Moses has come from in this, not wanting to be the mouthpiece for God, not wanting to be the leader of this, not wanting to do any of this, and God basically using him anyway. And now on the other side of this incredible victory and work of salvation that God has accomplished for the people of Israel, taking them out of slavery in Egypt and beginning the process of delivering them into the promised land. Yeah, Moses takes this opportunity to reflect and to compose this hymn of praise. And Miriam echoes it in her refrain as well. I do wonder, yeah, which came first, right? Is it, is Miriam singing this refrain and Moses picks up on it, or is, who knows? That's probably it's not relevant, but it's interesting that there's yeah, that their language mirrors each other in many ways. But yeah, I mean, in short, that's it. You know, God accomplishes this incredible act of salvation, and Moses commemorates it by putting it into song, and using an act of music to narrate the salvation story of God. That's the legacy that we have in this particular biblical song, biblical canticle.
Now, hearing kind of how you set that up, Ben, and then Jim, how you bring out some of the realities here, something that comes to mind, and I need to admit to everyone listening to this, my illiteracy on what I've discovered in contrast to Ben is the longer I've been out, the less opinionated I am about methods of worship. Like there was probably a point in my life where I would argue with you about whatever. Now I'm like, as long as you're like pointing people in the right direction, I'm not going to complain. So I've gotten less opinionated, and as far as like the musical side of things go, I couldn't tell you what a note was. Like I literally do not know how I should describe what so with that out of the way, we all know how low the bar is for me. Something that stuck out when you guys were describing this response from Moses and Miriam and the people of Israel is the spontaneity of it, which I mean, I guess they could have like planned. So I'm assuming they planned something like we're going to do this, whatever. But the way it reads is God does this incredible thing and they respond. And my question to the both of you is, we don't see that as much today. And I wonder if part of it is we don't see God working in such big ways now, whether that's a reality or we just don't see that, like we're bored. We just, anyway, so we don't have this spontaneity where we just see something and we're like, okay, we're going to respond, especially not corporately. And my question is, do we lose something when we lose that spontaneity? And because I know there are people who try to recapture it with how they lead worship, do we do ourselves a disservice when we try and call it capture spontaneity?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like
can I point something out here?
Yeah,
So
you're the one with the opinion.
within our relatively rigid, like European old school mindset, there isn't a lot of spontaneity. You're absolutely right. And even the spontaneity that you see from our evangelical brothers and sisters in the more like stripped down contemporary worship style that you see there, that's not quite what we're seeing from Moses and
Still
Miriam
planned.
here.
We're gonna all come together in this building at this time, and we'll be spontaneous there, but be there at 10 o'clock.
True. Yes. I think where you might see this more kind of in the vein of what Moses and Miriam are doing is in a black congregation. Because a lot of times in gospel music, like some of the refrains and lines and things that they're singing about are kind of spontaneously part of the song. And listening to some of the music and some of what I've been exposed to, like just watching the musicians as they participate in this, you can tell they are trying to follow whatever's going on in front of them, like lyrically, chorally, musically, whatever. And this is just whoever is leading the song or leading the solo or whatever is just pouring out to God what's on their heart at that moment. And so some of this still exists. It's just not something that is as familiar to us. And I'm guessing if we looked globally at Christianity, we'd see more of this too, beyond the American context.
Well, I also think it depends what songs you're singing. You know what I mean? Like most of the hymns in our hymnal have a backstory to them. Most were
True.
written directly engaging with societal circumstances, or the plague, or God's act of faithfulness and different things in different ways at different times. So actually, the hymnal companion to the Lutheran Service Book is a new resource that's out, and it has stories of all of the different hymns, and kind of gives a backstory on what the author was thinking and what the author was experiencing when the author wrote the hymn. And this definitely happens in modern song. There's stories to a lot of the different songs that are produced, whether they're from Lutheran theological perspectives or not. The songwriters initiative in 1948, University of Irvine, they're they have writing workshops where they get together and they write, and they intentionally take life circumstances and cultural circumstances and write songs in scripture and write songs of response. Is seeing the intersection of God's work in the world today. And you see this in other faith traditions as well, other Christian denominations, where this type of reaction is happening. So I do think that, you know, Now Think We All Are God has a backstory. Amazing Grace has a backstory. And it's not dissimilar to the backstory that we see here with the Song of Moses. I think y'all are right to see that Moses is reacting, and the people of Israel are reacting to what has just happened to them in song. And yet, part of the enduring legacy of songs and hymns and spiritual songs is this is what Paul teaches us in his epistle, that we learn the faith through them. So, because Moses has written this song commemorating God's work in the Exodus, we have access to it, that we too can make it our song. And by making it our song, we make that story our story. We participate in the Exodus. We are also delivered from slavery and delivered into the promised land. And we, through the lens of Jesus, have the fulfillment of that delivery, that we've been rescued from sin, death, and the power of the devil. And we have been delivered into the promised land of forgiveness, life, and salvation that is ours now, even as we await Christ's return. So I only say that to say that I think music works the same way. It's these hymns are lifting up narratives of God's work, God's faithfulness, and helping the community to rehearse those promises and to rehearse that narrative in a way that helps the community make it its own.
Maybe it's something to kind of riff off of that real quick. When Luther really dives into the image of the parting of the Red Sea as a kind of analogous to baptism, as God brings his people through from slavery and death into life and freedom. As I look at the language of Moses' song, there's so much in there about redemption and salvation, the greatness of God in that work, that I don't know the history on this, and I'd be interested to see more. But I wonder how much Luther making that connection was just looking at the story, or how much of that was reading something like this text and going, this is a salvation event. What else is a salvation event? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there, but it seems like it could be.
I certainly think you see that in the New Testament. Looking back to these Old Testament stories of salvation, the flood, here this Exodus deliverance, and the passing through water, the crossing the Jordan. All of these different passings through water are milestones of deliverance, and I certainly think that those are parallel theologically in baptism, often in the New Testament and through a lot of different Christian writings.
Now, something that comes to mind, and this is going to be an incendiary comment, and I'm going to make it anyway because no one's going to stop me. Because what I'm hearing, coming from what you were talking about, Jim, is that these songs, they have call it a formative, they have the effect of discipleship, which I think is something that a lot of you can experientially know. And what I mean by that, for those listening, is I bet you remember a lot of songs. I bet when they start playing on the radio, within 5 or 6 seconds, you can be like, I know this song. I know a lot of the lyrics. You might not have them right, but you at least know words that sound like whatever is being said. Um, and the songs have a way of just sticking in our head. And there's a lot of truth to how much substance there is. And Ben, you pick up on that with, like, this gives us more evidence for these incredible connections through scripture. But what that brings to mind for me is, if music and if songs are such powerful vessels for imprinting things on our hearts and on our minds, what does that say about what I think is a fair criticism of a lot of modern worship music? And that is, let's say the vessel is not filled. There's a lack of content. It tends to be very basic, very like. Whereas if you get some hymns, I'm not going to say all hymns, because there are some hymns that it's the same kind of. There's low level. It's essentially Jesus loves you with extra steps. But a lot of hymns, you'll get almost like a theological lesson that is built in through these verses. So I guess, what does that speak to? Should we be pursuing material that has deeper, I don't know, should we be taking more advantage of this vessel? What's kind of the
Yeah, it's a
gentlemen?
good kind of age-old question, right? And I was reminded of this recently in my congregation, Faith Lutheran in Georgetown, here in Texas. We just did I created a Google form where people could put in their favorite hymns and kind of come with a story of why it was their favorite hymn. Because, I'm new to the congregation as the associate pastor, and so I do the worship planning, and I pick hymns that I think that the congregation knows, and I have some expertise in hymnody. So it's the same thing, Josh. I pick the good hymns with the good stories and the good content. And I keep getting back that they don't know some of these hymns. So I said, just tell me what you know. Yeah, tell me your favorite hymns. And this has actually gone really well. And it's amazing that a person's favorite hymn, and I don't have the statistics exactly to back this up, but generally I've observed that a person's favorite hymn is not their favorite because of the theological content of it. But more times than not, it's the circumstantial use of it. This song was played at my wedding. This hymn was sung at my father's funeral or my grandfather's funeral. This was, marked a meaningful time for us with it. So, really these hymns become markers of whether it is events or milestones or different things like that. And that's what also makes them memorable. So I have learned to ask of our hymns and our songs, what do we expect the song to do? What is the goal for this song? Because I do think, Josh, to your point, many hymns teach and are poetically rich or doctrinally rich, and they have a particular purpose, and they should be used for that purpose. Repeating Taizé chorus does not have the same depth. Praise and worship song, with a repeating refrain, may or may not have the same theological depth to it. Many people critique, music that comes from the American tradition. You guys were even referencing some of that before, not only for its spontaneity, but also just the repetitiveness of it. People perceive as a lack of depth theologically, let's just say. And, I often disagree with people on that critique. The song is just doing something different. Repeated refrains are helpful for embodying a particular narrative. The horse and his rider, he is thrown into the sea. That's not that's not talking at all about, you know, God's work of salvation through Christ or the forgiveness of sins that He's won for us. This is like a significant earthly victory that God has won in a particular way, particular place at particular times. So, what do we expect a song to do, and how do we measure that expectation of the song? Some songs teach deeply. Some songs work widely and communally, and invite participation, are more accessible. And in fact, at Best Practices in Phoenix, coming up in about a month, I'll be leading a session on this. That kind of asks that question, like what do we expect a song to do, and how do we measure a song that way, rather than measuring every song with the same lens, the same measure. Not every song is going to teach the full, the full salvation narrative, and that's okay. But we also shouldn't make a diet of just all of, these simple refrains, because then we lose the depth. And we have to know what we're doing and be intentional about the variety that we curate for our congregations.
I think I'm going to be showing up to your talk there, Jim. Just so you know. Um, I something that resonated with me is you were talking about, like, at times the different focuses of different songs can strike people in new and interesting ways. I remember there's a college student in my congregation who, it was last summer, we were singing "Sing to the Lord." Uh, I think 808 in the hymnal, for those of you who have your hymnal floating around. Um, and he came up to me after church and he's like, "I think I have a new favorite hymn. It sounds like a sea shanty." I was like, "Okay, kind of, yeah, I'd buy that." And then he started making comments about wanting to be a pirate Christian, and, like, I feel like I lost him a little bit there. But then, like, a couple weeks later, he came back to me and he's like, "Man, that song's still stuck in my head, and I feel like I'm learning things." And I'm like,
It's cool.
that's what we want out of this. And the the cool part about that song for me is it's simple, but it says some cool things about God and some pretty profound things about God, and the way that He works in our lives. So, like, I don't know how much you got out of it, but I think you got something out of it. And as you were kind of pointing out, that should be the point of our worship music, is a little bit to teach, but a little bit more to know this God that we know and worship. So
Yeah, and the whole idea of, this gets to a bigger question about what worship even is, right? And who is worship for, and what is worship accomplishing? And a lot of uh, Christianity in the United States, is so influenced by moralistic therapeutic deism, which I imagine has come up on y'all's conversations before. That church makes me feel better about myself.
I actually don't think we have ever touched moral therapeutic deism on this.
Oh wow, okay, good. Well,
we've
Seasons,
definitely
I don't know
touched on
that.
moralistic therapeutic deism, but I don't think it's ever been more than a passing reference.
Yeah,
okay,
I
well,
think it's been on our topic list since season 1, and we've just never bothered to actually do an episode on it.
Well, I'll outline it briefly for the hearer, but then you guys can do another show on it, and get Bierman on or someone like that to really. But so moralistic therapeutic deism is a prevalent theological undercurrent in Christianity in the United States today. That church is designed to make you feel better about yourself. That's the therapeutic. That church is designed to teach you how to be a good person. That's the moralistic idea. And that church is designed to help orient your life around some belief in some God, uh, which is the deism type idea. So moralistic makes you a better person. Therapeutic makes you feel better about yourself. Deism orients you around some God. And so some of our songs that we sing in worship really align quite nicely, probably too nicely, with that agenda. making you feel better about yourself, making you feel like you're a better person, and aligning you around some nondescript God that we could sing this song in any number of faith traditions, and it probably would work the same way.
To be clear for everyone listening, we as a church body, we're not on board with moral.
Oh, yeah,
This isn't a positive thing.
correct. Yeah, I was just about
Just
to,
to be clear where we're at, everybody.
I was just making the turn. Like, this is a bad thing. And Lutherans do not play this game, and we should not play this game. This is not, we as theologians of the cross really have a completely different mindset about what the divine service is and who's at work and what's being accomplished and for the sake of whom. Um, so that when we come together for corporate worship, we're receiving the promises of God, forgiveness of sins, life, and salvation that are couched in the wider narrative of who God is and how God has redeemed the world through his son. So this story that we had, Exodus 15, pointing back to the Exodus narrative, it fits in this wider story of God's salvation, that God is the one that is working salvation for God's people, that God is the one that is enacting forgiveness, life, and salvation for the sake of the world. That is the point of Christianity, is to make known the work that God has done. Not to make us a better person, not to make us feel better about ourselves. And in fact, oftentimes when we come face to face with what God has done, we don't feel better about ourselves because we realize that we're sinful human beings that are in need of a savior. And we don't become better people because we, again, realize that we fall short of God's will and God's way. We're made better in and through Christ, through his forgiveness, through the life that he brings, through the salvation that he works and promises, even as we await his final return. So that is we need to make sure that we have our assumptions clear about what church is all about in the first place. And then the songs that we sing, we don't pick a song because people like it. We pick a song because it makes witness of who Christ is and what Christ has done for us. Now, it might be that some songs function in different ways and are more or less accessible, more or less repeatable, more or less whatever. We use different instrumentation, all sorts of different variety in music, and that's good. We like variety, we like the arts, but it's the centrality of what we're trying to accomplish that I think is up for grabs, and that's where I think this Song of Moses really points to um, what a Christian song accomplishes, pointing to God's salvation that God has worked. And then, if you look at the end of the song, uh, instilling fear in other peoples and other gods because of who our God is and what our God is doing. I mean, man, what if we were known for that? That like, look out, like our God is working salvation here, and this is a serious deal. So it's cool.
I think something that
Ben?
what
What?
what I think something that I don't know. Well, something I want to clarify first. I preached on some of the aspects of moralistic therapeutic deism recently, and I had somebody come up to me after church. Does this mean we can never feel good walking out of church? And I want to say no. That's not what we're trying to get at here. Like if you walk out of your worship service on Sunday feeling comforted by what God has done for you, and your conscience is at peace because you know that in spite of your sin, God is working through you to bring his message of life and salvation into the world. Um, Great. That is the exact feeling we want you to walk out of church and out of worship with. But if you walk out of worship feeling more full of yourself, that's not what we're going for. And let's talk about those things. Um, the let's being you and whichever one of us is your pastor, or if somebody else is your pastor, talk to your pastor about it. Um, but as Jim was kind of getting at there, um, as we look at the content of what we're singing and using as part of our worship, as part of our services, uh, sometimes there are things that maybe are discipling us in ways that we don't want them to. That do disciple us towards things like moralistic therapeutic deism, or just uh, towards like a self-centered idea of the Christian faith, whether or not it makes you feel good. Um, and when we encounter these things, Jim, I want to throw it back to you for a second here. When we encounter these things in our worship, and for some people that's kind of just the style of their local church. They prefer that kind of song. And for some people, that may not be as problematic in terms of the way that it's discipling them, but for others, it could be a real concern. So, what would you recommend in terms of trying to push back on the negative discipling that some of that music can do, and instead push toward what we want to be happening in people's hearts and minds as they hear preaching and worship and those kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll try to give a quick but layered response. All right. So the first answer that I would have is we put too much faith in music, right? And we put music's too much the emphasis on worship in the first place. So like the Song of Moses here is not a song that is enacting someone's salvation or facilitating the um, parting of the Red Sea. Like God does that, and then we sing about it. So the songs are a response to God's work of salvation. They are not the catalyst of God's work of salvation. And this is where we get in trouble, is that a lot of us think that when we come together for corporate worship, it's about the music and it's about what songs we sing, the style that they're in, whether I like that style or not, what service I go to based on what style of music is being sung at that. Like, that's all. I mean, it's fine to have your preferences. There's no problem. But that's not what makes worship worship. What makes worship worship is the preaching of the gospel and the administration of the sacraments that the Christian community comes together around so that they might tell the story of God's salvation among themselves and for the sake of the world. So where music helps us with that, we should celebrate. Where music gets in the way, we should critique it. But it's never the catalyst itself. It's always pointing to who God is and what God is doing. That's the first thing. It's like let's just not make so big of a deal out of music. Let's make sure that we're making a big deal out of the way that the Christian community comes together around the Word of God as it's preached and as it is received through the sacraments. So then, when we do sing, then we just need to be intentional about the songs that we sing, and that means different things in different contexts. So, and yeah, different contexts are more or less comfortable with different song patterns, musical, instrumental accompaniments, things like that, and that's fine. Like different communities can have different preferences. Different individuals within communities can have different preferences, and you just have to navigate that. What's right and what's wrong, boy, that's pretty subjective, right? There's some songs that I like that other people don't like at all. There's some songs that I didn't like until I learned the story about them, and then now I actually really like the song. One example is "How He Loves," a little bit older song now, but was made popular by Christian artist David Crowder. Most people just can't. Many people I know, how about that? Can't stand that song. They think it's ridiculously emotive and affective. I actually like it, but I know the backstory of it. It was written by a guy who had lost I think it was a close friend, and he was lamenting as he's writing the song of God's love. Well, that makes it mean something different to me than it does, if you're just singing what seems to be kind of a empty or vacuous love song. Um, uh, we need songs when we're in the pit. We need songs that help us lament and help us emote when we are at the depths of our sorrows. That is a good thing. And a lot of people who come into church are in the pit and they need songs that help them name that and express that. So, what do you expect a song to do? And how do we keep songs from being the main thing in worship? Because really, they are a response to God's narrative. They're not the catalyst to the narrative.
we're getting short on time here, so we're gonna power through the end of this, and we'll go to takeaways, which we always never warn people about. So, Jim, if you were to have people take away one thing from this, and you got to keep it brief, uh, what would that one thing be?
Yeah, don't be afraid to love songs and love singing and worship. And use your songs to point to the narrative of who God is and what God has done for you and for the sake of the world.
Josh?
If songs and music and praise and worship are vessels for imprinting things on our heart and mind, be aware of what you're filling the vessel with. Ben?
Cool. I'm gonna go with different songs mean different things to different people. So meditate on what that song is doing for you, but then also ask the people who like it, because it might mean a different thing to them. It might have a different story for them. It might be discipling them in a different way, and they can maybe help you with something that is maybe not your favorite. So, with that, we thank you so much for joining us, Jim. Thank you for battling through that pesky cough to join us today for an episode. Do you have anything you want to plug really, really quick before we go?
Oh, no, I just plug going to church and receiving the promises of God in faith.
Okay. And go to his, if you're going to best practices, go to his talk.
There you go.
Um,
Yeah, come see me.
He might not want to plug anything, but we will shamelessly. Like our episode, if that's something that the platform you're listening on does, go ahead and subscribe to us on whatever platform you listen, and all the other ones if you're really feeling dedicated to the cause. And if you have a topic or a guest that you would like us to talk about or to bring on, you can let us know. Text us, reach out to the Facebook page. We'll add it to the list. It might be a minute. So, and buy the shirt with our faces on it if you're really, really dedicated to the show. With all that being said, brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.